December 6th, 2013, Austin, Texas. 52-year-old Lillian Reese, a quiet music teacher from Hyde Park, spent her evening wrapping Christmas gifts for her students. Before turning in, she sent a short text to her colleague, "I'll bring sweet rolls for class tomorrow." But the next morning, she never arrived. Her car was still parked in the driveway, her purse still by the door, the lights inside her home still burning. When police entered, everything appeared perfectly normal, except for a faint smear of blood on the bedroom light switch, a few drops on the pillowcase, and her favorite silver necklace missing. There were no footprints, no forced entry. And for 9 long years, her disappearance remained one of the most unsettling mysteries in Austin's history. A story locked in silence, until a single strand of DNA changed everything. Tonight, we reopen that silence and uncover what really happened inside that quiet blue house on Avenue G. But before we begin, tell me in the comments, where are you watching from? I want to know how far this story will travel, and whether your town, your city, hides a cold case that's still waiting to be solved. If you believe every story deserves its truth, subscribe, follow, and turn on the bell. Because somewhere out there, another mystery is still waiting in the dark. Austin, Texas, December 2013. The city was dressed in winter's silence, its streets in Hyde Park lined with old oaks casting long shadows under the soft glow of Christmas lights. On the corner of Avenue G, inside a small blue house, Lillian Reese moved quietly through her evening ritual. 52 years old, she was known for her gentle smile and the way her voice carried when she taught music at the elementary school. That night, the house was filled with the muted warmth of lamplight, the delicate sound of tissue paper as she wrapped Christmas gifts for her students. She hummed "Silent Night," her voice drifting in and out, rising just above the distant hum of a city winding down. Neighbors would later recall that she had always been the last to turn off her porch light. That light, a beacon at the edge of the street, seemed to keep the dark at bay. Yet on this night, there was an unusual quiet. The world outside seemed to hesitate, holding its breath. Just after 8:30 p.m., Lillian sent a message to her colleague, a quick text about bringing sweet rolls for class the next day. A small, ordinary promise, quickly typed out and sent, not knowing it would be her last. She placed her phone on the kitchen counter, arranged the last gift under her modest tree, and stood for a moment in the doorway of her living room, gazing at the snowflake decorations she had taped to the window. The silence felt comfortable, a familiar solitude. But something, she thought, felt slightly off. Maybe it was nothing, a shift in the air, a flicker of uncertainty that passed as quickly as it came. That night, as the neighborhood settled into sleep, Lillian's house remained still. The porch light glowed through the darkness. No one saw her leave. No sound disturbed the night. The next morning, her car was found parked in the driveway, untouched. The early sun reflected off the frost that dusted its windshield. Inside, everything was in place. The door remained locked, the lights still burning. The only sign of life, the sweet rolls still on the counter, waiting to be packed. She hadn't left for work. The first person to notice was her next-door neighbor, Naomi Clark. A quiet woman, Naomi often watched the world through her curtains. She was the one who, years later, would say in a hushed voice that the porch light had stayed on until morning, never blinking out the way it usually did. She remembered the eerie stillness of the house, how it seemed untouched by time or weather, as if the night had never ended there. By noon, colleagues began to worry. Messages went unanswered. The school tried calling. By afternoon, the concern turned into a low, persistent dread. When Naomi was asked if she had heard or seen anything, she shook her head but confessed a growing unease, the kind that lingers without explanation. It wasn't until that evening that someone called the police. Officers arrived quietly, cautious not to alarm the neighbors, but their faces set with a seriousness that made even the children pause their play. They knocked, waited, then circled the house. The windows showed nothing but the reflection of their own uniforms. With a practiced efficiency, they forced open the door. Inside, they found a scene almost painfully ordinary. The couch was neatly arranged, a half-empty cup of tea beside a stack of sheet music. Her bedroom door stood ajar. The bed perfectly made except for a single pillow turned over, as if someone had sat there for just a moment. Nothing broken, nothing stolen, nothing amiss, except for the absence that echoed through every room. But it was in the small, everyday details that the strangeness lingered. A faint smear of blood on the bedroom light switch. A few drops, barely visible, on the edge of a pillowcase. The rest of the house was spotless, as if time had stopped. The only thing missing was her favorite silver necklace, a small charm she always wore, a gift from her mother. There were no footprints in the yard, no signs of forced entry, no witnesses, no sounds, not even the neighborhood dogs barking in alarm. The case file would later read, in block letters, "Suspicious disappearance, Reese, Lillian." For Detective Mark Ellison, who first stepped into that silent house, there was something chilling in its untouched order. He stood in the doorway, the December cold pressing in behind him, and whispered under his breath, "Whoever did this knew exactly what they were doing." Outside, the holiday lights twinkled on, indifferent. But from that night forward, the music that had filled Lillian's home fell silent, replaced by a quiet that would not leave. The world kept turning, but in that small blue house, time seemed to hold its breath, waiting for an answer that would not come. Morning sunlight filtered through the blinds, exposing a house that seemed frozen in the instant before something irrevocable. As officers moved through the rooms, gloves snapping against their wrists, every surface felt both familiar and hostile. There was a kind of order to Lillian Reese's home that made the investigation all the more unsettling. A stage perfectly set, and yet the main actor had vanished. The entry was secure, no lock tampered with, no window forced. In the living room, holiday cards and wrapped gifts sat undisturbed, their cheerful patterns suddenly ominous in the absence of their intended recipient. In the kitchen, flour dusted the countertop in ghostly patches. The mug of tea, long since gone cold, sat with a thin skin on the surface, hinting at how quickly the normal pace of life had been interrupted. Police worked in silence. They bagged the sweet rolls, logged the time on the kitchen clock, and took photos of every detail from the coat draped neatly over the chair to the music books stacked precisely on the piano. In Lillian's bedroom, the smell of her lavender lotion lingered, defiant against the sterile scent of latex and disinfectant brought in by the search team. They moved slowly, methodically, almost reverently, as if careful not to disturb the last traces of her presence. It was in this room that they found the only sign of struggle. On the wall by the light switch, a tiny smear of blood, so small it could have been missed with a careless glance. On the pillowcase, a few drops drying to a rusty brown. Not enough for panic, but enough to raise alarms. This house, so pristine, was hiding a fracture. One detective cataloging the scene noticed something missing. Lillian's favorite necklace, a silver chain she wore daily, had vanished from its usual place on the jewelry stand. The other necklaces and earrings remained untouched. The implication was quiet but clear. Someone had chosen it, someone who knew its value or who wanted to make it personal. There were no signs that anyone had come or gone in haste. The front door was locked, porch light left on, as if Lillian herself had performed these rituals before vanishing into thin air. The police dusted for prints, combed the yard for footprints, searching for any clue left in the frost. The ground yielded nothing. No shoe marks, no cigarette butts, not even the usual litter from passing cars. Whatever happened, it was done with a precision that left no trace behind. Neighbors gathered on the sidewalk, whispering theories with the uneasy excitement that tragedy brings to a quiet street. Naomi Clark described seeing nothing out of the ordinary, just the familiar glow of Lillian's porch. Another neighbor remarked that the only odd thing was how peaceful the night had seemed, as if the world itself had been holding its breath. In the station, the case was labeled with cold bureaucracy. Suspicious disappearance. Reese, Lillian. Files were opened, checklists created. Officers combed through Lillian's recent messages and phone calls, searching for some missed warning, some prelude to the silence that had overtaken her life. The text about sweet rolls was her last known communication. There was nothing else. Detective Mark Ellison, the senior investigator, pored over every detail with a calm intensity. He had seen missing persons before. Runaways, debts gone bad, family disputes that escalated and then faded. But something about this scene, its strange cleanliness, its unbroken routine, unsettled him. He noted the missing necklace, the untouched car, the spotless entryway. It felt deliberate, calculated. He walked the property again, eyes scanning the hedges, the gate, the garage door with its faint dent from last spring. No tools left behind, no trampled grass, not a single out-of-place item. The only sound was the occasional distant bark of a dog and the wind rattling a string of Christmas lights against the gutter. News of Lillian's disappearance spread quickly through the school and local community. Flyers were printed, taped to street lamps, shared online. Vigils were held, candles flickering in the evening cold as neighbors tried to push back the darkness with collective hope. But the investigation, for all its energy, ran up against a wall of nothingness. The lack of evidence was almost as suspicious as any overt clue. Everything pointed to an intruder who moved with confidence, purpose, and the knowledge of what not to leave behind. Ellison, sitting at his desk long after his colleagues had gone home, whispered to himself the thought that had followed him all day. Whoever did this knew exactly what they were doing. Night settled over Hyde Park once again, the blue house standing silent at the corner. Inside, the echoes of Lillian's last song lingered in the still air, waiting for someone to break the spell and answer the question the city was too afraid to ask. Where had she gone? And who had taken her? Days passed, and the normal rhythm of the Hyde Park neighborhood fractured under the weight of absence. Lillian Reese's house became a quiet landmark, a daily reminder that someone had vanished from within its orderly walls. Her students returned to class, some too young to understand the gravity of what was missing, others looking at the empty music room and sensing, in the hush that settled there, the shadow of fear. The investigation persisted, moving in measured steps. Detectives canvassed the area, knocking on doors with worn knuckles and patient expressions. Most neighbors had little to offer, nothing but the memory of a silent night, an ordinary evening interrupted only by the faint shimmer of Christmas lights across wet pavement. But Naomi Clark, Lillian's next-door neighbor, hesitated before sharing her memory. In the uneasy hour between midnight and dawn, she had glimpsed a vehicle, a silver pickup truck, its engine idling low, headlights off, creeping past the house around 2 a.m. It had not stopped. It simply moved with deliberate slowness, a prowler passing through the deep shadows of the sleeping block. Naomi had watched from behind her curtain, unease prickling her skin, and wondered whether to mention it. In the end, she did. Police took the report and pressed for more, but Naomi had little else to add. Her view had been partially obscured by the oak in her yard, and she never saw who was driving. It might have faded into the catalogue of uncertain memories if not for another, less human witness, a thermal security camera set up across the street, installed by a neighbor paranoid about package thefts. The grainy footage was scrubbed for details. What stood out was the faint heat signature of a truck's exhaust lingering in the cold air, the outline of a license plate momentarily caught in the frame as it rolled by Lillian's house. Detectives traced the registration. The truck belonged to Evan McBride, a man of 46 who had lived in the neighborhood years before, known for odd jobs, mowing lawns, repairing fences. He had done work for Lillian in the past, though it had been many months since they'd last spoken. McBride lived on the edge of the city now, in a faded house with a sun-bleached yard and blinds that never lifted. When police questioned him, he met their eyes without flinching. Calm, even bored, he told them he hadn't been near Hyde Park for months. He offered no alibi but seemed unworried by the scrutiny. Detective Ellison's instincts prickled. Routine background checks revealed little of interest. No violent history, a few minor citations for unpaid parking tickets, a reputation for keeping to himself. But the connection lingered, a persistent thread. Forensic technicians searched the truck with methodical precision, swabbing seats, collecting fibers, running tests on every surface. What they found was subtle, a small, nearly invisible trace of blood on the back seat. The sample matched Lillian Reese. The evidence was chilling but incomplete. There was no proof of when the blood had been deposited, no video showing Evan at the scene, no indication that a crime had taken place within the vehicle. The chain of custody had too many gaps. Word of McBride's involvement circulated quietly through the police department and eventually, in whispers, through the neighborhood. But in the absence of a body, in the absence of direct evidence, the case could not proceed. The law demanded certainty, and certainty was as scarce as warmth in the rooms of Lillian's empty home. As weeks stretched into months, the investigation stalled. The hope that had flared when the silver truck was traced began to gutter out. Evan McBride, with his unyielding calm and careful answers, slipped back into his quiet routine. There were no arrests, no new evidence, no confession, no witnesses, no closure. Silence returned, deeper and heavier than before. For Lillian's family, the waiting became its own kind of torment. Her mother called the police station daily, voice frayed and polite, asking for news. The detective's replies grew shorter. Friends left flowers at the doorstep, notes written in hopeful script that faded in the winter sun. The blue house became less a home and more a question, unresolved and haunting. In the official files, the case was marked Open Unsolved. The paperwork thickened, The details cooled into memory, and eventually, even rumor subsided. There was no justice, only the ache of uncertainty that settled over Hyde Park and did not lift. The world continued, but for those who cared, the music in Lillian Reese's house had stopped, and silence, once so ordinary, had become a verdict all its own. Seasons changed in Austin. Spring's humidity pressed in, giving way to summer's fierce heat, then yielding once more to the muted chill of winter. The blue house at the corner of Hyde Park, once alive with melody and light, became just another address, a shadow among other shadows on a street that had learned to look away. In the wake of the initial investigation, the case began its slow drift toward oblivion. The officers who had searched the rooms and walked the frosted yard turned to newer files, fresher crises. The first week after Lillian Reese's disappearance, police cruisers drove by the house every night. By the second month, they came only when someone called about the porch light, which stayed on until morning more and more often, a silent memorial to the life that had flickered and vanished. The neighbors' conversations, once tinged with worry and speculation, thinned into awkward silence. Some moved away, their own lives edged by a discomfort they never put into words. Others, especially the old-timers, changed their routines, walking dogs a different route, parking a little closer to their front doors. Naomi Clark continued to watch through her curtain, but with less hope and more resignation. Inside the Austin Police Department, the file labeled Reese Lillian Unresolved Cold Case gathered dust. It was not forgotten exactly, but it became something to step around, a difficult problem postponed until new resources or new eyes might see what everyone else had missed. Photographs, maps, and evidence bags were sealed away in storage, their meaning dulled by time. The official narrative grew colder, more clinical. No new leads. Case remains open. Further information pending. Detective Mark Ellison, who had first felt the wrongness of the silent, orderly house, kept a copy of the case summary in his desk. Some nights he would read through it again, almost against his will, tracing the gaps and absences that defied explanation. He told himself he would let it go, but he never quite did. For Lillian's mother, Evelyn Reese, the passage of time was measured not in days, but in the slow erosion of hope. Every Christmas, she drove alone to her daughter's house. She would park in the same spot, step carefully onto the porch, and place a candle in the window beside Lillian's faded photograph. She whispered, as she always had, "Come home, if you can." The ritual never changed. She never stopped believing that some miracle might break the spell and bring her daughter back, whole and unharmed. Inside the house, dust settled on untouched furniture. A piano went out of tune. Plants died, replaced occasionally by neighbors hoping to keep the place looking alive. But nothing could disguise the sense that the house was waiting for someone. Each new tenant, there were a few, all brief, left quickly, unsettled by the unspoken tension that seemed to press in from the walls. Ellison sometimes drove by late at night. The blue paint was chipped now, the front walk cracked by roots, the porch light flickering on and off. He thought of Lillian's voice, recalled secondhand from those who knew her, a voice that by all accounts had been soft but unwavering, a presence that filled the classroom and her home. The music was gone now, but the silence was not peaceful. It was haunted. With every year that passed, memories of Lillian receded further from the public mind. The school hired a new music teacher. The children who had once sung for her graduated and moved on. Her story became a cautionary tale for newcomers. the woman who disappeared, the house on the corner, the case they never solved. But for those who loved her, grief did not soften. It settled in the bones, a cold certainty that something precious had been stolen and would not be returned. The police files swelled with newer cases, but occasionally a rookie officer would be assigned to read through the old ones. Most gave up quickly, daunted by the absence of evidence. Lillian's disappearance had left no clean fingerprints, no clear motive, no body to mourn. Just a necklace missing and a few drops of blood, dried into obscurity. The case seemed to mock the very idea of justice. Time worked its erosion. The files yellowed, newsprint faded. But Ellison, now older and wearier, kept a private record. Dates, sightings, the anniversaries that no one else remembered. He marked each year with a note in his calendar, a quiet promise that he would not allow the story to fade entirely. Yet, outwardly, the city forgot. Life resumed its normal patterns. The blue house stood as a silent marker of what had been lost and what had never been found. The music teacher who vanished became a question that nobody wanted to answer. But in the darkness of every December, one candle still burned in the window, and a mother's whisper still lingered, lost to the cold and to the years. Nearly a decade had slipped by since Lillian Reese's disappearance. In Austin, the city kept growing, swallowing old neighborhoods, painting over the cracks of history with new shops, new faces, new ambitions. But in a cramped office in the corner of the Austin Police Department's headquarters, the cold case files waited, silent, dense, patient. The folder labeled Reese Lillian lay beneath others, the edges worn thin by years of quiet handling. January 2022. Advances in forensic science had given detectives a new vocabulary of hope. The Cold Case Unit, a small team armed with technology undreamt of in 2013, began the slow, methodical process of reopening files long thought unsolvable. Their newest weapon, touch DNA analysis, a technique so sensitive it could lift genetic profiles from surfaces years after contact, from mere skin cells invisible to the eye. The team moved through the city's archive of tragedies, searching for the rare case that might finally yield its secret. When Lillian's file landed on the desk of forensic analyst Carla Mendoza, she studied it without expectation. The case summary was brief. The photographs, a bloodied pillowcase, a spotless house, a missing necklace, offered few clues. Still, protocol demanded every trace of evidence be re-examined. The pillowcase, sealed in its evidence bag, was carefully removed, fibers tested and catalogued. Carla's gloved hands worked with reverence. To her, each object was not just a clue, but a fragment of a story cut short. The laboratory's new machines hummed quietly as samples were prepared. Days passed with no result, just as in hundreds of other cases. Then, almost as an afterthought, the analyst tried a section of the pillowcase the original team had overlooked. The inner seam, where fingers might have brushed in haste or fear. What the machine found was not Lillian's DNA, nor was it Evan McBride's, whose shadow had hung over the investigation for so long. Instead, the results produced a third profile, a male, not present in any of the earlier reports. This discovery, routine in its procedure but extraordinary in implication, triggered a new round of analysis. The DNA was uploaded to the national database. Within hours, there was a match. Shane Larkin, 38 years old, with a record for burglary and theft, an old associate of Evan McBride. His name had never surfaced during the original investigation. But now, by the grace of time and technology, he was in the system. Detective Mark Ellison, who had quietly monitored the case for years, felt the old chill as he read the printout. 9 years had dulled neither his sense of duty nor his intuition. There was, he understood now, another layer to the story. Shane Larkin had a reputation, a string of burglaries, mostly targeting women living alone, always leaving little trace but sometimes taking small, sentimental jewelry. Larkin's pattern was subtle. He avoided violence, or so his record suggested. But here, his DNA appeared at the center of a scene that had never fit a simple narrative. The cold case unit built their timeline, reconstructing the events of that December night, not with memories, but with data. They cross-referenced old witness statements with Larkin's known whereabouts, mapped cell phone records, checked pawn shops for any sign of Lillian's necklace. Slowly, painstakingly, they drew lines between people who had once barely known each other, but whose lives had now become inextricably entwined. Word of the break spread quietly through the department. Hope was cautious, edged with doubt. There had been false starts before, leads that promised resolution only to dissolve in the hard light of legal scrutiny. But this was different. DNA did not lie. It did not grow tired or forget. Its silence was absolute, but its testimony, once found, was undeniable. After 9 long years, the case was open again. In the sterile glow of the laboratory, under the watchful eye of investigators who had refused to forget, a new possibility emerged. The truth had been hidden not by distance or darkness, but by the thinness of evidence. A trace of skin, a few cells clinging to the cotton threads of a pillowcase. Yet it was enough. For the first time in years, there was a direction. The silence that had swallowed Lillian's story began, slowly, to break. The reemergence of Lillian Reese's case brought a peculiar energy to the Austin Police Department. Detective Mark Ellison, older now, worked methodically, resisting the urge to let hope outrun procedure. His years in the force had trained him to distrust breakthroughs, to move slowly, to let the details build a narrative more reliable than any witness memory. But this time, he felt something shift, an uneasy certainty that the old silence might finally yield an answer. With the DNA match pointing toward Shane Larkin, the case widened. Ellison and the cold case team began to examine not just Lillian's disappearance, but the broader pattern surrounding it. They turned to 2 other unsolved burglaries from the same winter, their files faded by time but still marked by unease. Both had occurred within a 10-mile radius of Lillian's home. Both victims were women who lived alone. Both homes had been left untouched, almost eerily so, with only small, personal jewelry missing. A gold locket in one case, a wedding band in another. No violence, no ransacking. The kind of clean, careful intrusion that left a wound deeper than theft. Ellison visited each scene again, long after the dust had settled and the details had begun to blur. He stood in the doorways, eyes closed, picturing the rooms as they must have looked that winter. In each case, the entry had been effortless. A window left unlatched. A back door whose lock was easily slipped. He compared the reports, searching for something that might have been missed in the first rush of investigation. What emerged was a pattern as deliberate as it was chilling. In all 3 scenes, including Lillian's, footprints had been found outside, half preserved in winter mud or frost. They matched a Timberline boot, size 11. The prints were so consistent, so precise in their intervals, that Ellison felt the echo of someone moving with intent, not desperation. He wrote it in his report. This isn't a random thief. He chooses his victims, and he wants to control them. He pulled Larkin's record again. A history of breaking and entering. A few stints in county jail, but nothing that had ever risen to violence. Yet here, with the DNA evidence tying him to the Reese house, and with Evan McBride's name lingering in the background, the lines between trespass and something darker blurred. Larkin's association with McBride was thin but suggestive. Old friends, occasional work partners, drifting through Austin's margins. Ellison built a timeline, cross-referencing the burglaries, Larkin's known movements, and the long shadow cast by McBride's truck in the thermal camera footage from years before. Late nights, Ellison sat at his desk under the flicker of fluorescent lights, arranging crime scene photos and maps, pushing pins into a bulletin board that had faded under the weight of unanswered questions. He let the details haunt him. 3 women, 3 homes, 3 items of jewelry, each chosen, each irreplaceable to their owners. A thief who left almost nothing behind but the discomfort of absence. For the department, this new pattern gave the case momentum. The behavioral analysts joined, sketching profiles from the evidence. A man meticulous in his methods, drawn not just to objects, but to the act of entering private spaces and leaving them changed. Not a thrill seeker or a desperate addict, but someone who moved through silence with patience, as if performing a ritual he alone understood. Slowly, the story began to fit together. It was not a crime of passion or an act of random cruelty. It was something colder, more methodical, a series of intrusions culminating in one that had crossed an irreversible line. And always, at the edge, the absence of Lillian Reese, her home too quiet, her life cut off, her memory persisting only in the careful files and the annual rituals of those who refused to let her be forgotten. Ellison compiled his findings into a report, detailing the connections that the original investigators could not have seen. The same boot, the same kind of victim, the same type of missing item, and now the same suspect. As he filed the document, he felt the burden of years lift, just slightly. For the first time since the night the music stopped in the blue house on Hyde Park's corner, the story was not only about what had been lost. It was about a pattern that could finally be named, and a silence that might, at last, be broken. February 2022. The Austin sky had the brittle, empty look of late winter. Each morning began with cold light breaking over the city's rooftops, dissolving slowly into colorless afternoons. In the police station, momentum was gathering. For years, the file marked Reese Lillian had been little more than a ghost, a presence felt, not seen, surfacing in the uneasy silences of the cold case unit. Now, with DNA evidence, behavioral profiles, and new connections mapped out across a web of evidence, it was as if the case had begun to breathe again. Detective Mark Ellison was at the center of the renewed effort. He coordinated with patrol units and forensic teams, reviewed legal briefs, and kept one cautious eye on the slender thread tying Shane Larkin and Evan McBride together. Neither man had a history of violence, but the darkness at the heart of the story suggested something neither would admit. They had crossed the line between the ordinary and the irreparable. The sense of unease never left Ellison as he moved through his days. The warrant for Evan McBride's arrest came first. It was executed with quiet precision. Before dawn on February 12th, police cars lined the curb outside McBride's modest home in East Austin. Lights off, radios silent. Officers moved with professional calm, encircling the house. There was no resistance. McBride opened the door when the knock came, stepping back with a kind of blank resignation that spoke less of guilt and more of inevitability. He was handcuffed, led to the squad car, and driven to headquarters as the sun began to rise. In the interrogation room, McBride sat with his hands folded on the table. His expression never shifted, his voice stayed level. Hours passed. The air in the small room thickened with the weight of the past, with the questions that had gathered over 9 silent years. Ellison watched McBride's composure, noting the small gestures, an absent scratch at his wrist, a glance at the mirrored glass, looking for cracks. But McBride remained silent for 8 hours, giving nothing away, until finally, with a voice barely more than a whisper, he muttered that he didn't kill her, that he had only told Shane to pick up a few things that belonged to me. There was no further confession, no details offered. But for Ellison, it was a fissure, a line that could be pried open. The investigation now turned fully to Shane Larkin. His name had haunted the file since the DNA match, his history of burglary and opportunism casting a long, ambiguous shadow. Surveillance units tracked him through the city. His routine was unpredictable, shifting from couch to couch, job to job, always on the move. But eventually, the net closed. 2 days after McBride's arrest, Larkin was found in a small apartment on the outskirts, a place cluttered with the random detritus of a transient life. Inside, detectives uncovered a drawer filled with jewelry, rings, bracelets, pendants. Among them was a silver chain, its clasp tarnished, the initials LR engraved on the back. It was the missing necklace, unmistakable from Lillian's photographs. The evidence was bagged, catalogued, and sent for analysis. Ellison stood in the narrow living room as officers moved around him, the cold sense of finality settling in his bones. The end was near, but it would come in whispers, not proclamations. Larkin's interrogation was not the dramatic unraveling so often imagined in fiction. He denied everything at first, his voice quick and brittle, eyes darting to the corners of the room as if searching for an exit. The police laid out the evidence methodically. The DNA on the pillowcase, the witness testimony, the necklace itself. Hours passed in heavy silence. Only when confronted with the scientific certainty of the DNA match did his resolve begin to collapse. His hands shook. His words stuttered. When the story finally came, it arrived broken, incomplete, as if even now Larkin could not quite believe the events he was recounting. He said he thought the house was empty. He had gone in to pick up a few things for Evan, nothing more. But then Lillian was there, awake, startled. She screamed. In that moment, Larkin panicked. He remembered grabbing her, remembered the sound of her voice breaking, the sudden collapse of struggle. Afterward, there was only silence, heavy and absolute. He confessed that they had driven her body out past the city, toward the wooded banks of the Colorado River, and buried her under the trees. As the confession was recorded and transcribed, the police station seemed to fall still. Even the usual clatter of phones and printers faded, as if the building itself was listening. Outside, evening shadows lengthened over the streets. Ellison sat in his office, reading the statement over and over, the horror and sadness layered beneath each flat sentence. It was not justice yet, but it was truth. A cold, slow truth unearthed after nearly a decade of waiting. The silence that had smothered Lillian's story for so long had finally broken, not with answers that brought comfort, but with a confession that stripped the case of ambiguity. She had not simply disappeared. She had not run away or vanished into some gentle unknown. Her life had ended with violence, fear, and the carelessness of men who thought themselves invisible. For Ellison and the cold case team, the work was not done. There would be searches, paperwork, court hearings. For Lillian's family, there would be grief, raw and fresh, a wound reopened by the knowledge of what had been lost. But in the blue house on the corner, in the rooms that had waited so long for an explanation, a new kind of silence settled, a silence that contained, at last, the shape of truth. The confession changed everything. The abstract outlines of the case grew sharp, and for the first time in 9 years, the investigation had a direction, a bleak, specific place on the map. With Shane Larkin's statement in hand, the Austin Police Department coordinated an immediate search. The world outside was washed in pale, brittle winter sunlight as officers assembled near the wooded banks of the Colorado River. The spot Larkin described was remote, a place where city sounds faded into the hush of trees and the slow churn of water. For 2 days, teams worked methodically, sectioning off ground, pushing through underbrush and tangled limbs. K-9 units moved in careful lines, their handlers tense and silent. Ground-penetrating radar swept across the soil, the screen flickering with shapes and shadows. Old roots, lost stones, animal burrows. Detectives and volunteers picked through the debris, their boots leaving careful prints in mud softened by rain. Every footstep carried the hope of an ending and the weight of its cost. Ellison stood at the perimeter, watching the line advance. It was painstaking work, the kind that required more patience than hope. Some officers were new to the department, young enough to have been children when Lillian disappeared. They worked in silence, aware of the gravity in the air, a communal sense that something buried would soon be unearthed, that the story which had haunted the city's memory was about to become real, tactile, and irreversible. On the second afternoon, the radar crew paused over a shallow dip beneath a cluster of cedar trees. The ground was softer here, a patch of earth that resisted with the memory of recent disturbance. A pair of officers approached, shovels and gloves ready. The silence was so deep that the scraping of metal on soil seemed deafening. Inch by inch they worked, lifting earth in careful increments, the tension rising with each passing minute. Then, beneath a few inches of mud and fallen leaves, a scrap of fabric appeared. A pale pink, dulled by time and soil, but unmistakably a woman's robe. The digging slowed. The officers' movements grew gentler. Layer by layer, they uncovered the remains. Lillian Reese was found lying on her side, the pink wool robe still wrapped around her, her hair matted but intact. Beside her, half buried in the dirt, was a broken silver bracelet, one that matched the description her mother had given nearly a decade before. The medical examiner arrived, moving with the solemnity of someone who knows that science, in moments like this, is an act of respect. They worked slowly, cataloging the scene, gathering every trace, each object bagged and labeled with the care reserved for something sacred. It was not just about evidence. It was about returning Lillian to her family, about ending a story that had festered too long in darkness. As news of the discovery spread, the mood shifted across the city. For those who had watched the case with distant sympathy, there was relief but also an undercurrent of sorrow, a reminder that closure is often another word for mourning. At the site, a young officer stood by the shallow grave, hat in hand, and whispered that she could finally go home. It was not a prayer. but a kind of benediction, a recognition of the long journey through silence and uncertainty. The forensic report confirmed what many had feared. Lillian's cause of death was strangulation. There were no signs of sexual assault, no indications of further violence. Her death, though violent, had been quick. The small comfort it offered was swallowed by the greater tragedy of what had been lost. A life ended not by accident, but by intention, and hidden beneath the indifferent sweep of the river's edge. For Detective Ellison, the discovery brought a cold, aching satisfaction. He watched as the scene was cleared, as the body was respectfully covered and lifted from the earth. The years of waiting, of following dead ends and false leads, had finally ended in a kind of justice. Yet it was a justice that did not heal, only clarified. The blue house on the corner of Hyde Park would never again be just a house. The music that had filled it would not return. But now there was at least an answer, a hard, irrefutable truth to set against the long ache of mystery. The case file was updated, the missing person now a name in the homicide files. The silence that had hovered over Hyde Park was broken, not by the return of what was lost, but by the certainty of its fate. Lillian Reese had come home not to the life she had left, but to the city that had refused, for nearly a decade, to forget her. For her mother, for her friends, and for the officers who had carried her story forward, it was an ending. Not the one anyone wanted, but an ending all the same. As evening fell, the search teams dispersed, their voices low, faces marked by fatigue and the weight of a job completed. The river rolled on, its currents unchanged, but in the hush that followed, something had shifted, a silence no longer empty, but filled with memory, with grief, and with the hard-won peace that only truth can bring. June 2023. Austin shimmered in the first heat of summer, the city moving with the uneasy tempo of another ordinary day. Yet at the Travis County Courthouse, there was a feeling of gravity, a hush that set the old building apart from the flow of life outside. For the first time, after nearly a decade of questions and absence, the case of Lillian Reese would be judged, not by rumor or speculation, but by law. Inside, the courtroom filled quickly. Reporters pressed into the back row, pens poised. Neighbors sat in silent solidarity, eyes cast downward. Lillian's family gathered near the front, her mother Evelyn holding a framed photo, her grip steady, her face closed in determination and sorrow. On the other side, Evan McBride and Shane Larkin waited beneath the bright, cold glare of fluorescent lights, faces drawn, the weight of years finally settling upon them. The trial was methodical, deliberate, unhurried. Prosecutors began with the evidence, each piece handled with a kind of reverence. There was the DNA, found on the pillowcase after 9 years. There was the silver necklace, engraved with Lillian's initials, recovered from Larkin's apartment, still tarnished with soil. There were the patterns, the behavioral profiles, the confessions. The years of waiting had stripped the story of its mystery, but not its pain. It was all laid bare for the jury. The silence of the house, the broken routine, the chain of decisions that ended with a life buried by the river. Larkin's confession was read aloud, its flat phrases echoing through the courtroom. There were no outbursts, no scenes of dramatic protest. Both men seemed hollowed by the process. McBride silent, Larkin pale, his hands folded tightly in his lap. The defense did what it could, questioning motive, time, the possibility of doubt, but the chain was unbroken. Forensic science, steady and implacable, left little room for uncertainty. 4 hours. That was all the jury needed. They returned, faces drawn and serious, delivering their verdict in voices that trembled slightly at the edges. Evan McBride, guilty. Life in prison, without the possibility of parole. Shane Larkin, guilty. 25 years. The courtroom fell silent at the words, a silence that felt deeper than any before. Evelyn Reese stood as the verdict was read, the photograph of her daughter held high, a single tear tracing the line of her cheek. She did not speak loudly, only softly, as if to herself and to the memory of the girl who had vanished. I don't hate them. I just want my daughter to rest. Her words hung in the air, a benediction and a release, and for a long moment, no one moved. Justice, in its slow and imperfect way, had come, yet the finality brought little comfort. The wounds left by violence were not healed by verdicts, nor were the stolen years returned. The blue house on the corner would never be the same, nor would the city that had carried Lillian's memory forward. But there was a sense as the day ended and the courthouse emptied that something had changed. The music that had been silenced found an echo in the hearts of those who remembered, and for the first time, the story of Lillian Reese had an ending. Outside, dusk settled over Austin. The courthouse lights glimmered as people drifted away, returning to the world beyond the doors. For Evelyn, for her family, and for everyone who had waited so long, justice had arrived quietly, solemn and unadorned. The song that had been interrupted was not restored, but its last note had finally been played. After the trial, Austin's rhythms resumed, but something in the city's heart had shifted. The blue house in Hyde Park, long a silent witness to absence, slowly faded back into the fabric of the neighborhood. Its porch light was changed, the windows cleaned, new paint covered the chips and cracks, but nothing could erase the years of waiting or the memories woven into its walls. The space where Lillian's music once filled the rooms remained, now quieter, the echo of her life lingering like a song that played just out of reach. In the months that followed, people spoke less of the crime and more of its cost. At the elementary school, a plaque was placed in the music room, simple, bearing Lillian Reese's name, a testament to her quiet influence. Her former students, some now grown, came back to share memories, their voices subdued. They remembered the way she smiled when they struggled through new notes, the patience she showed with each discordant sound, and the way she insisted that every voice, no matter how small, could find its place in the harmony. In a local paper, an article appeared, tracing the story from disappearance to verdict. The reporter wrote not of brutality, but of perseverance, the slow, relentless search for answers, the science that had finally spoken when memory could not. The case, readers learned, was inspired by the true story of Kathy Blair, another music teacher lost to violence, another life marked by years of unanswered questions. In remembering Lillian, the city remembered Kathy as well, a parallel story, a warning and a hope entwined. There were lessons drawn from the long journey to justice, though none were simple or easy. The case proved that no crime stays hidden forever. It showed the power of new science and the stubborn patience of those who refuse to let a story fade. It reminded people to trust instincts, to speak up when something feels wrong, and to remember that violence's ripple is wide, touching not just one life, but many. It steals music, peace, and memory from entire communities. Each December, Evelyn Reese still lights a candle in her daughter's window, even if only for herself. She stands for a moment in the soft glow, letting silence settle, not as an enemy, but as a companion, a space where grief, memory, and love exist together. The city, too, pauses sometimes, listening for what's gone and what remains. In the end, what endures is not the act of violence, but the acts of remembrance. Lillian's kindness and music continue in small ways, in the students who sing, in the teachers who persevere, in the families who hold on to hope even when reason says not to. The story's final truth is not just one of loss, but of connection, a reminder that, while wounds can be deep, only truth and memory can begin to heal them. The final record of the case notes: justice delivered, community changed, memory preserved. Some wounds remain, but the silence, at last, is no longer empty. It is full of echoes, of music, of love, of the determination that no one should be forgotten.